What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a system overview for combat in Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader, just a bit ahead of its release about a month or so thanks to a preview copy provided by Owlcat Games that is only really missing the last couple acts of the title, and because of its pretty complete state, I'm able to bring you guides like this ahead of the game. And with this particular video, what I want to cover are the basics of combat and how all the systems and various properties mesh together to make the whole. As such, this is not like a deep dive into you should use this ability at this time kind of thing, but rather what all the terms mean, how all these pieces fit together. With that in mind, as with any real RPG, a lot of this starts in character menus, as you have to understand those to understand how your character is performing in combat. That said, this video is going to be time-stamped, so if you want to jump ahead to the more combat-specific part, feel free, but we're going to start with our characteristics, or abilities, attributes, whatever you want to call them, which is probably a good place to mention that this game's core system is based off of a tabletop game by the same name, though it has been modified and changed. So while there is technically a source for some of this stuff, not all of it is exactly one for one. That said, let's start with weapon and ballistics skill. These are your melee and ranged weapon skills, respectively. However, they don't really affect your damage with those weapons, just how good you are with them. So for melee weapons, or your weapon skill, increasing this will increase your chance to hit by reducing enemy parry and dodge chance, on top of increasing your ability to perform a critical hit, because when you move to attack an enemy, in melee in particular, it's largely your weapon skill versus their weapon skill, and whoever has the higher skill has the advantage in that situation, which makes the enemy less likely to parry your attack or be able to dodge out of the way. So if you want to make a melee character, it's really all about weapon skill. Ballistic skill is much the same, affecting their base chance to hit, and the enemy might be able to attempt to perform a dodge, but that's primarily for area of effect abilities. But if you want to use guns in any event, you naturally need a high ballistic skill. In terms of combat, strength will give you extra damage with melee weapons, whereas toughness makes your character more resilient by being more resistant to the accumulation of injuries, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the healing section, but it also affects your character's base amount of wounds, which is to say their HP, which are for some reason called wounds in this game, which is a little bit awkward, but whenever it mentions wounds specifically, it's talking about the HP of your character. Whereas in terms of damage or injuries, it means literally injuries or then later traumas. Agility will improve your character's initiative, dodge chance, and the dodge reduction you put on enemies via your melee weapons if you are a melee character. Intelligence doesn't directly affect combat in many ways, but it is the primary stat for a lot of abilities that you might use in combat, though it won't have any direct effect. Awareness, on the other hand, will reduce the enemy's chance to dodge as well. And then we have willpower. Willpower is a psyker stat, your space magic, if you will. Everyone else, it will reduce their chance of taking negative mental effects. But for psykers in particular, willpower is their main stat for their damage and ability scaling. So unless you're a psyker, you won't really pay much attention to this stat. And then last but not least, we have fellowship, or your charisma, basically. This affects many abilities for the officer in particular, who directs and commands their peers on the battlefield. So that covers the base characteristics and what they translate to in terms of combat abilities, but from there we still have quite a bit to cover. So now I want to talk about the stats you're going to see on the equipment itself, which is things like armor, deflection, dodge, parry, and general things of that nature. But if we take a look at our character's character screen, of course, we can see all these different numbers. For starters, the characteristics we just talked about, but directly under that we have a line of several numbers that relate to various important combat numbers. For starters, over here on the left, we have our deflection stat. Deflection can be gained from a few different sources, but primarily heavy armor. Pretty much no character starts with the ability to use heavy armor. It's something you have to pick up the proficiency for via leveling up, but deflection is primarily gained through heavy armor, and deflection is just flat damage reduction. So this particular character has 1 deflection, so that means every single bit of damage that comes their way is automatically reduced by 1, which isn't significant because I'm not wearing heavy armor. Now the number right next to that, however, is our armor percentage. This is the percentage of damage that is reduced after deflection is taken off the top. So when we get hit and we take damage, deflection reduces the maximum, and then your armor reduces that amount that is left by a certain percentage. So in this case, 25%. But obviously, the more armor we have, the more that can be reduced. So your damage mitigation in terms of actually getting hit and taking damage is mostly a product of deflection and armor. But we also have a variety of other ways to mitigate damage, primarily dodging and parrying. Parrying is of course melee oriented, so if it's not a melee character and you're not holding a melee weapon, it's not going to come up. But dodge, on the other hand, is pretty much for everybody. Everyone has a base chance of 30% plus whatever their agility is. However, that chance to dodge is immediately reduced by the attacker's perception among any other form of dodge reduction they might have. So while this character does have a pretty good dodge chance, it will be reduced by whatever the enemy is doing. And after all, it is a percentage chance, which means you can definitely still get hit, but you will attempt to dodge when you are attacked. Though, as you can see at the bottom of this text block, if you are attacked with an area attack and you attempt to dodge, you can only move 3 cells on the combat field to get out of that attack. And if that's not enough, you're still going to get hit. But then right next to that stat, we have dodge reduction. This number is how much your character is reducing the enemy's chance to dodge when you attack. And then finally on this list, we have our resolve. Resolve is how much momentum you gain when you kill an enemy or your turn begins. We'll talk about momentum here in a little bit, as it is a very important metric in combat to keep track of. Now from there, let's talk about stats on weapons, which can be divided into, I would consider, melee, ranged weapons, and then things like staves. So in terms of melee weapons, outside of obviously just things like damage, a big thing you want to keep your eye on is armor penetration. This is how much percentage of the enemy's armor that we are cutting through. So you can see with this very good weapon that I have equipped, I'm reducing their percentage of armor by 35%. So while you might run into enemies with a high armor percentage, thus reducing a lot of the damage you're trying to do, you can overcome that via armor penetration. But then we have ranged weapons. These obviously have a little more going on, like rate of fire, recoil, range, max ammo. Ammo and range are pretty self-explanatory, but what might go unnoticed is rate of fire and recoil. Basically, as you can see on this screen here, most ranged weapons that aren't deliberately single-shot weapons can fire in a burst. When you do that, you'll fire that weapon's rate of fire, so in this case it would be 6, spread out over an area. However, this is done at the cost of accuracy, because that's where recoil comes in. Recoil is the percentage of chance to hit that you lose with every shot fired. So with a recoil of 15% here, basically every shot after the first one, I am losing 15% of my chance to hit. But again, this is over a big sweeping area. Now, where that can get a little more complicated is with things like flamers or flamethrowers, because these also have a sort of AoE, but technically it's only one stream, if you will, of fire. So you don't have to worry about things like recoil for a flamethrower, obviously. So those are important stats to keep an eye on in terms of each individual weapon you might be looking at. And something you might notice is when you're looking at something like a sniper rifle, which only has a rate of fire of 1, it doesn't give you a recoil stat because you're only firing the one shot, and thus recoil in the sense that it is used in this game doesn't really apply. Now, when it comes to weapons, we're not quite done, because as I'm sure you've seen on all these weapons, they have a variety of weapon abilities. This determines how they attack. Most melee weapons, for instance, have a single target attack and then a sort of slashing move that will hit a few tiles in front of you. Ranged have their single shot or burst modes. And then things like staves for psychers are kind of an in-between, whereas they have the melee strike option because it's a staff, but also they'll get abilities directly related to their psyker as well. This is how psychers can use certain things like chain lightning and things with their weapons, as opposed to having to know that particular psychic power. So certainly something to keep in mind. And all of that put together means that beyond just the damage a weapon does, how it deals that damage to the enemy is just as important, and something you need to understand when you're looking at the description for individual weapons. Now, with all that stuff out of the way, let's start talking about actual combat systems and how it works. As I'm sure you've seen on screen, and you might have guessed by some of the words words I've used up to this point, this is a turn-based tactical game. As such, when you start combat, there's a few things to know right away. If you are aware of the encounter you're about to get into, you will enter a preparation phase where you're allowed to set up your characters by putting them in specific spots and kind of getting ready for combat. If you are surprised by an enemy attack, this is not an option and you're kind of just stuck with wherever your characters are. It is possible to adjust your party's formation when you're walking outside of combat, but for the most part, that preparation in most instances makes that not a big deal. Another thing that happens right as combat starts, though, is that you all roll initiative, which is to say the turn order. This can be seen on the left of the screen here, and as a base, this is calculated by adding your agility and perception bonuses divided by 2 combined with a D10 roll to establish your initiative. But it is a little more complicated than that because technically initiative is rolled for a variety of groups of allies and enemies. That's important because your allied groups and your enemy groups alternate with each other. This ensures that you won't just get wiped before you even get a chance to take a turn due to how the initiative roll played out, which is important because there's often a lot of, I would say, numbers of enemies, with many of them really only serving the purpose to be just kind of obliterated by your big area of effect abilities to kind of make you feel powerful in classic Warhammer 40k fashion. And because of that, you'll run into a lot of enemies who are very much so intended to die in one hit. But because there's so many, if they didn't roll initiative in this way, it would lead to the possibility of you being overrun before you even got to move. So while your characters will be rolling initiative, do keep in mind that the actual roll is mostly used to determine which group your characters fall into, which is then alternated with enemies. So how exactly that looks might vary a little bit. But from there, once we are actually in combat and taking our turns and everything, at that point, the system is a combination of movement points and action points. Movement points are pretty self-explanatory. This is how far your character can move, indicated by the green on the screen when it's your turn. And action points are, of course, spent on abilities and attacks. However, it's important to note that typically, under normal circumstances, once your character makes an attack, that's it for their turn. It will take all your movement points away and you'll be done. However, there are a lot of abilities and things to get around this. In fact, a lot of, I would say, the tactical side of the combat here is setting yourself up to take as many turns as possible until you run out of action points. This can be done via heroic acts, which we're about to talk about, alongside of special abilities you'll get as you level up that allow you to make attacks that don't count against your attack limit for that turn, such as the marksman's basic run and gun ability, which allows them to move and take another attack. Another thing to keep in mind during combat is, of course, cover. Now, a lot of this is going to change based on the difficulty settings you have the game on, but at a base chance, that is to say normal basically, half cover will give you a 35% reduction to being hit by an enemy, so it reduces their hit chance by 35%. Full cover reduces that chance by 60%. Full and half cover is noted by either the half shield or the full shield with a skull on it. So like many tactical games, it is important to make sure that you're not just leaving characters out in the open where they're going to bear the full brunt of an enemy's attack most likely. And while all of that is pretty basic as far as these systems go, a lot of the nuance here is how well you are using all of your various abilities to make this more fun. For instance, there's a variety of abilities that don't actually make an attack and allow you to either buff yourself, debuff enemies, or perform more interesting effects. And those things, combined with the basic rules, are where a lot of the satisfaction of combat is going to come in. But everything I've mentioned thus far isn't your only options. You do have access to consumables. Every character has 4 consumable slots which can be used to hold a variety of things like grenades, throwables, and of course things like medkits. So outside of just your character's abilities based on all the decisions you've made about building that character, you can also just slap some grenades on them and have them chuck them at enemies. Now, perhaps probably the most important aspect of combat is, I would say, the momentum bar. This is the bar to the right of the character portrait when it is your turn. This can either increase or decrease as you perform in combat. If you're doing well, it'll go up, and if you're doing poorly, it will decrease. Both of those events can lead to either a heroic act or a desperate measure. These are sort of ultimate abilities that your characters will have access to depending on your performance in combat. And because these activate at opposite ends of the momentum bar, the worst you can do in combat is usually just okay, as that will drag things out. If you do incredibly well, or if you're doing badly, you'll get to access these really strong abilities that can turn the tide of the battle. Heroic acts or desperate measures, these abilities are typically associated with the class or archetype that your character is. For instance, the warrior gets one called Daring Breach, that allows them to make an unlimited number of attacks per turn, provided they have the action points to do so, and it can even be upgraded to give them movement points in between kills as well, meaning that where they could only attack one enemy before, they can run and attack multiple enemies many times over and potentially kill like 4 or 5 or even more in a single turn. Whereas the marksman ability is much the same, but at ranged instead. Meanwhile, the base officer archetype can use their heroic moment, if you will, to just grant another ally a full turn with a bunch of bonuses. There's actually a lot more of these based on the archetypes, so while the 4 base archetypes of the game will get one of these abilities each, the later archetypes also unlock more of these. Now, how much the momentum bar goes up is a product of that character's resolve. When your character begins their turn, that will go up by a certain amount, and then when you kill enemies, it will continue to go up. However, vice versa, when the enemy's turn rolls around and they hit you, it will be reduced. So managing momentum is a big part of combat, and this is where all those little cannon fodder enemies I mentioned come in. There are a lot of enemies that only have enough health to basically survive a single hit. These are what those enemies are for. You're meant to just kind of brutalize them, build up your momentum, and then use that to wipe the floor with the rest of the enemies. Which leads to a sort of general combat flow where you're meant to feel really powerful, because that's kind of what this setting is all about. Which means in many ways, it pays to either do really well or do poorly, because that's going to lead to the sort of explosive combat that these types of setups lean towards. Whereas if you're just doing okay, you'll kind of drag around in the middle, which can drag combat out. Which brings an interesting dynamic, I would say, to the overall combat system. But that brings us to Veil Tears. If you've noticed, opposite of the momentum bar there is another bar that will fill up when you use certain abilities. This is the Veil, or your chance of drawing the Warp. The Warp is the chaotic energies of the world. As Psychers use their abilities, their psychic powers, or enemies do so, things like demons, etc., it will increase this meter. Once it passes a certain threshold, your continued use of psychic powers, or the enemies even, can lead to chaotic effects on the battlefield, such as summoning more enemies being a most basic example of it. Which means if you're just absolutely going ham with very powerful psychic abilities, you run the risk of drawing more attention to yourself from the Warp, which can have all sorts of detrimental effects on both the combat and naturally leads to a lot of chaotic potential. Though that finally does bring me to, I would say, the last thing I want to touch on, and that is healing. You might have noticed throughout all of this, I mentioned healing very little. And that's because, unlike a game like, say, Pathfinder or something where resting is a big part of it, it is frankly a little less so in this game, but it is still something to keep an eye on. Basically, after combat ends, your characters will heal, all the way to full. However, where you get into dangerous territory is with injuries and traumas. As you take a lot of damage in combat, this can lead to an injury. The same thing with running over a trap outside of combat, or even in certain dialogue events. Injuries by themselves aren't that bad. You can heal them right away with medical kits, provided you have a character who can do that for you and based on their own Medicae skill. It's usually not a big deal to get rid of injuries though. However, get enough injuries and this will eventually lead to a trauma. If your character goes down in combat, they will still be revived afterward automatically, but they will have a trauma. Traumas are big detrimental hits to your characteristic stats usually. Now, whereas injuries can be healed with medkits and things like that in the field, so to speak, traumas you can only heal by going back to your ship. Or basically if there's a narrative reason that you'll have gotten some decent rest. So while you will heal outside of combat and everything, if you do poorly, you run over a lot of traps, this will lead to injuries and traumas which have major detrimental effects on your characters, which impedes your combat effectiveness as you continue to move forward on that map until eventually you might lead yourself to a game over. So while there isn't a rest system per se, it is still an important thing to keep an eye on with how your characters are doing overall. So while you don't really need something like a dedicated healer, though there are healing abilities, for instance the Biomancer will get some abilities that actually directly allow you to heal your teammates in combat. You can use medkits to heal up as well. There are a variety of abilities that give you temporary HP even. I would say the game isn't wildly balanced around you having a healer, or at least a dedicated one anyway, which is certainly an interesting approach for a game like this, as that's not typically how those things work, frankly. But all of that is pretty much what you can expect from combat in Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader, and as a matter of personal opinion, I would say this system isn't quite as complicated as something like Pathfinder, but still allows enough strategical depth and character building, which you can check out via my character creation video I've already put out, that it can give you a really satisfying tactical experience based on the character that you've made, while at the same time just being more approachable than Owlcat's previous work. And honestly, I'm very interested in seeing people's reaction to this once they get their hands on it, because on one hand, it is still fairly in-depth. If you watch my character creation video, you'll definitely see that. You have a lot of options, there's a lot of stuff going on. But it's also undeniably easier to get into than something like the Pathfinder games, which are notoriously hard to get into with a high bar of entry, primarily because of the knowledge needed to play them effectively. And this combat system at least seems to attempt to bridge a lot of those gaps in a way that I hope is friendly to newcomers and appeals to people like myself more familiar with these types of games. Overall though, I'm enjoying it so far, and I'll have to see how it shapes up across the rest of the game. But in the meantime, I certainly hope you enjoyed this video, hope you found it informative. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know what you think of all this down in the comment section below. If you have any questions about something I maybe didn't cover here, feel free to ask. In the meantime though, regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.